There was a time when you could walk from Britain to the continent of Europe. Not across a bridge. Not through a tunnel. Across dry land, through forests and river valleys and wetlands, past the camps of hunting communities and the migratory paths of animals that moved between what are now separate countries without crossing any water at all. This was not ancient myth or geological speculation. It was the world as it existed 8,000 years ago, when the sea levels of the North Atlantic were significantly lower than they are today, and the floor of what is now the North Sea was a landscape of forests, lakes, rivers, and marshes supporting a human population that had no idea their world was about to be swallowed by the ocean. The land they lived on is called Doggerland. The name comes from the Dogger Bank, a shallow area of the southern North Sea where fishing boats have been snagging their nets on ancient peat and hauling up mammoth bones and worked flint for more than a century. The land beneath the water was real, and the people who lived on it were real, and what happened to them, the slow drowning of their world over the course of several thousand years as the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted and the sea rose around them, is one of the more striking stories in the long record of human experience. Doggerland was not a small place. At its maximum extent, during the period of lowest sea levels, it covered an area comparable in size to the modern United Kingdom. It was bounded to the west by the rising coastline of what is now Britain, to the east by the coasts of what are now Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and to the north by the shallow basin that is now the southern North Sea. At its center was a substantial landmass, the Dogger Hills, a region of higher ground that would have been the last part of the landscape to be submerged as the sea rose. The drowning of Doggerland was not sudden. It unfolded over thousands of years, the sea rising in fits and starts as the ice melted, advancing in some periods and pausing in others, giving the people who lived on the landscape time to adjust, to move, to adapt their lives to a world that was changing in ways that may have been perceptible within a single human lifetime. The communities who lived on Doggerland were not wiped out by a single catastrophe. They were displaced, gradually and repeatedly, as the land they knew became water. The story of Doggerland is, in this sense, not a story about the remote past in the sense of something finished and set apart from the present. It is a story about the relationship between people and places, about what it means to know a landscape deeply and to watch it change, and about the specific human experience of losing not people or things but the world itself, the familiar ground, the specific places that hold the memory of the community that has lived within them across many generations. The story of Doggerland belongs to a larger story about the end of the last ice age and the transformation of the world that followed. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, the ice sheets that covered much of northern Europe and North America locked up so much of the Earth's water that global sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The North Sea basin was dry land. The English Channel was a river valley through which the ancestors of the Thames and the Rhine flowed toward the Atlantic. Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula of northwest Europe, connected to the continent by a broad land bridge that hunter-gatherer communities moved across freely. As the climate warmed and the ice retreated, the meltwater that poured into the world's oceans caused sea levels to rise, slowly at first and then more rapidly as the great ice sheets of Scandinavia and North America collapsed. The rate of sea level rise during the period of Doggerland's flooding was not uniform. There were periods of relative stability when the sea level held steady for long enough that communities could establish themselves on newly formed coastlines, and there were periods of rapid flooding when the water advanced quickly enough that the change would have been visible within a generation. The specific event that may have accelerated the final flooding of Doggerland is one of the most dramatic in the geological record of northern Europe. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive submarine landslide on the continental shelf off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, generated a tsunami that swept across the North Sea basin. The communities living on the low-lying coastal areas of Doggerland at the time would have experienced this event as a catastrophic inundation, and the sediment layers associated with the Storegga tsunami have been identified in coastal deposits around the North Sea, providing a precise geological marker for this specific episode of flooding. Whether the Storegga tsunami was the final event that converted the Dogger Hills from a populated island into the shallow sandbank now called the Dogger Bank, or whether it was simply one dramatic episode in a longer process of gradual submersion, is a question that the evidence does not completely resolve. What is clear is that by around 7,000 years ago, Doggerland as a substantial landmass had effectively ceased to exist, and the people who had lived on it had moved to the margins of the new coastlines or had been absorbed into the communities of what were now clearly separate landmasses. The specific experience of watching a familiar landscape disappear beneath water is one that most people today have no personal reference for, and the imaginative effort required to understand what the communities of Doggerland went through is correspondingly difficult. The nearest modern analogues, the communities living in coastal areas that are experiencing accelerating erosion or regular flooding, give some sense of what the emotional and practical dimensions of such an experience might be like, but even these analogues fall short of the full scale of the Doggerland transformation. The landscape that Doggerland once was can now be partially reconstructed from the evidence preserved on the seabed. The floor of the southern North Sea is not a featureless plain. It is a complex terrain of ridges and valleys, of buried river channels and ancient lake basins, of peat deposits that formed in the wetlands of the ancient landscape and that have survived beneath the water in conditions of low oxygen and limited biological activity that have preserved their organic content for thousands of years. The mapping of this terrain, using the seismic survey data that the oil and gas industry routinely collects as part of its exploration activities in the North Sea, has allowed researchers to reconstruct the ancient topography of Doggerland in considerable detail. The rivers that flowed across Doggerland were extensions of the modern river systems of Britain and the continent. The Thames continued east from its current mouth across the exposed North Sea basin, joining with rivers flowing north from what is now France and Belgium to form a major river system, sometimes called the Channel River, that drained the western portion of the basin. The Rhine and the other rivers of northern Europe flowed northwest across the exposed basin, cutting channels in the soft sediments that are still visible in the seismic data as buried valleys beneath the modern seabed. The Dogger Hills, the elevated core of the Doggerland landmass, would have been a prominent feature of the landscape, rising above the surrounding wetlands and river valleys to provide higher ground that was drier and more exposed than the lowland areas around it. The hills would have offered good hunting ground for the communities of the region, and the evidence from the Dogger Bank, where dredged material has produced animal bones, plant remains, and occasional artifacts, suggests that the area was used by human communities across the full span of its above-water existence. The peat deposits that have been recovered from the North Sea floor, some of them dredged by fishing boats and others sampled by scientific expeditions, contain pollen sequences that allow the vegetation of the ancient landscape to be reconstructed. The picture they provide is of a landscape dominated by mixed woodland, with birch, pine, hazel, oak, and elm covering the upland areas, and with reed beds, marsh vegetation, and the riparian woodland of river margins occupying the wetter lowland zones. It was a rich and productive landscape, the kind of environment that hunter-gatherer communities exploited very effectively, and the density of human occupation it could have supported was probably substantial. The rivers of the ancient landscape were not simply corridors for the movement of people and goods. They were the primary organizing features of the human geography of Doggerland, the lines along which communities were distributed and the connections that linked them to each other across the landscape. The specific river systems of Doggerland, reconstructed from the buried channels visible in the seismic data, define the skeleton of the ancient human geography in the same way that river systems define the human geography of every landscape where people have lived without the benefit of roads or other constructed transport infrastructure. The evidence for human occupation of Doggerland is indirect but accumulating, and the picture it provides of the communities who lived there is becoming more detailed as research methods improve. The most abundant category of evidence comes from the fishing industry. For more than a century, fishing boats operating in the southern North Sea have been recovering material from the seabed that includes the bones of extinct animals, pieces of preserved peat, and occasional worked flint objects that are clearly the products of human activity. The bones include those of woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, straight-tusked elephant, and other species that were present in northern Europe during and after the last ice age. The worked flint includes blades, scrapers, and points that are consistent with the tool-making traditions of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities, the people who inhabited northwest Europe in the period between the end of the last ice age and the arrival of farming. The problem with this evidence is that it lacks context. Objects dredged from the seabed have been removed from the stratigraphic relationships that would allow them to be dated precisely and associated with specific features of the ancient landscape. They are artifacts without provenance, informative about the general character of human activity in the region, but unable to tell us where exactly people were living, what they were doing, or how they were organized. Transforming these decontextualized objects into a coherent picture of Mesolithic life on Doggerland requires combining them with the environmental evidence from the peat samples and the topographic evidence from the seismic surveys. In recent years, scientific expeditions have begun to conduct systematic surveys of specific areas of the North Sea floor, recovering sediment cores and biological samples from carefully selected locations and analyzing them for the full range of evidence they contain. The pollen sequences from these cores allow the local vegetation history to be reconstructed in detail, and the identification of specific plant species associated with human disturbance, the weeds and pioneer plants that colonize cleared ground, provides indirect evidence for human activity that the worked flint alone cannot supply. The most direct evidence yet recovered for human activity in the Doggerland region came from a sediment core extracted from the floor of the North Sea as part of a research project studying the relationship between sea level change and human occupation. The core contained a layer of peat within which researchers identified a human-modified landscape feature, a structure interpreted as a platform or walkway built from wooden posts driven into the marsh sediment. The radiocarbon dates from the wood place the feature in the Mesolithic period, making it one of the earliest known examples of constructed wooden architecture in northwest Europe and one of the very few direct traces of human activity on the drowned landscape of Doggerland. The communities who lived on Doggerland were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and understanding their way of life requires understanding what that term means in the specific context of post-glacial northwest Europe. The Mesolithic period in northwest Europe covers roughly the time from around 10,000 years ago, when the ice sheets had retreated sufficiently to allow human recolonization of the region, to around 6,000 years ago, when farming communities began to spread into the area from the southeast. During this period, the communities of northwest Europe lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plant foods, moving through the landscape in patterns determined by the seasonal availability of different resources rather than settling permanently in fixed locations. The word hunter-gatherer carries connotations of simplicity and marginality that the evidence from northwest Europe does not support. The Mesolithic communities of this region were not struggling at the edge of subsistence. They were sophisticated, mobile, well-equipped communities that knew their landscapes in extraordinary detail, that had developed technologies specifically adapted to the resources of the post-glacial environment, and that maintained complex social networks connecting communities across wide geographic areas. The toolkits they used, characterized by small, precisely made flint blades called microliths that were hafted into composite tools of bone, wood, and antler, represent a high level of technical knowledge and manufacturing skill. The landscape of Doggerland would have been particularly rich from the perspective of Mesolithic subsistence. The wetland margins that surrounded the Dogger Hills and lined the river valleys of the ancient landscape were among the most productive environments available to hunter-gatherers in temperate Europe. They provided fish, waterfowl, and aquatic mammals, as well as the plant foods of the marsh margins. The river valleys provided deer, wild boar, and other terrestrial game. The more open upland areas of the Dogger Hills supported other species that complemented the wetland resources. The communities who exploited these resources were almost certainly not permanently resident on Doggerland. They were part of a broader regional population that moved between different parts of the landscape in patterns determined by the season and by the specific resources available at different times of year. The communities who spent winters in the sheltered river valleys of Doggerland might have moved to the uplands in summer, or to the coast in the seasons when marine resources were most abundant. The idea of a fixed homeland does not apply well to these communities, whose relationship to the landscape was one of seasonal movement rather than permanent residence. The specific knowledge required to live effectively in the Doggerland environment was acquired through long experience and transmitted through both formal teaching and through the participation of younger community members in the activities of their elders. The routes between seasonal camps, the locations of reliable water sources, the patterns of animal movement through specific parts of the landscape at specific times of year, the locations of good flint outcrops for the production of tools. All of this constituted a body of knowledge that was as sophisticated as any body of technical knowledge produced by later, more complex societies, and that was as essential to the survival and well-being of the community as any institutional infrastructure. The flooding of Doggerland was experienced by the people who lived through it as a gradual transformation of their world, not as a sudden catastrophe. Over the course of several thousand years, the coastlines of the Doggerland landscape retreated, the lower valleys flooded, the wetland margins expanded and then became open water, and the communities who had lived on specific parts of the landscape found that those specific places were no longer available to them. The adjustment to each increment of flooding would have been managed within the framework of the mobile, flexible subsistence strategy that Mesolithic communities had already developed for managing seasonal variability in their environment. Moving to higher ground when the lower areas flooded was not fundamentally different from moving to different parts of the landscape when specific resources became seasonally unavailable. But the cumulative effect of generations of retreat was profound. The landscape that had supported the communities of Doggerland shrank over time, and the communities that had lived across a territory the size of the modern United Kingdom were gradually compressed onto the margins of what were becoming the coastlines of Britain and the continent. The population density of these marginal areas increased as the inland territories were flooded, and the social and ecological consequences of this compression would have been significant. The Storegga tsunami, if it struck the remaining coastal areas of Doggerland around 8,000 years ago, would have been a very different kind of event from the gradual flooding that preceded it. A tsunami generated by a major submarine landslide would have arrived without warning, moving at speeds that made any immediate response impossible. The communities living on the low-lying coastal areas of the surviving Doggerland landscape would have had no experience of such an event, no oral tradition that described or anticipated it, no preparation for its scale. The physical evidence for the Storegga tsunami in coastal sediment sequences around the North Sea includes layers of marine sediment deposited inland by the wave, sometimes many meters above the contemporary sea level, speaking to the height and the force of the water that swept across the low-lying areas. The survivors of the Storegga event, if they existed in significant numbers, would have found themselves in a landscape that had been dramatically transformed by the wave. The low-lying areas they had inhabited were underwater or covered in marine sediment. The communities that had lived there were dispersed. The specific knowledge of that specific landscape, accumulated across generations and embedded in the cultural practices of the community, was no longer relevant to the new geography that had replaced it. The experience of the Storegga tsunami, if the communities of the surviving Doggerland landscape experienced it directly, would have been unlike anything in the accumulated experience of those communities or in the oral traditions that guided their understanding of how the world worked. The sudden, unpredictable inundation of the coastal areas by water moving at heights far above the normal high tide would have overwhelmed any preparations that might otherwise have been possible, and the aftermath of the event, the changed coastline, the destroyed camps, the altered landscape, would have required a rapid and complete reorganization of the community's relationship to its physical environment. The archaeology of the communities that lived around the margins of Doggerland, on the coastlines that were gradually revealed as the sea rose on what is now Britain and the continent, provides the best evidence available for the way of life of the people who occupied the drowned landscape itself. The site of Starcar in Yorkshire, excavated in the 1940s and again more recently, is one of the most thoroughly studied Mesolithic sites in northwest Europe, and its evidence for the life of post-glacial hunter-gatherers in the period when Doggerland was still substantially intact is directly relevant to the understanding of the communities that lived to the east. Starcar was occupied around 10,000 years ago, when the sea level was still substantially lower than today and when the landscape of what is now the southern North Sea was still largely dry land. The site was located on the edge of a lake in what is now the Vale of Pickering in North Yorkshire, and the waterlogged conditions of the site preserved organic materials that rarely survive in drier archaeological contexts. The organic preservation at Starcar allowed researchers to recover wooden objects, worked bone and antler, and even the remains of a wooden platform built at the lake edge. Among the most discussed finds from the site are the red deer skull frontlets, modified skulls with the antlers attached, apparently worn as headdresses or masks in ritual or hunting contexts. The craftsmanship of these objects speaks to a community that invested significant effort in the creation of symbolic objects, and the ritual or ceremonial context in which they were used speaks to a social and spiritual life that was more complex than the basic subsistence activities of hunting and gathering alone might suggest. The evidence from Starcar for the organization of space at a Mesolithic camp, with different areas of the site used for different activities, including hide preparation, antler working, and food processing, paints a picture of a community that managed its domestic and productive activities with a specific spatial logic. The platform at the lake edge, built from posts driven into the marsh sediment, is the same kind of constructed feature that has been identified on the submerged seabed of the North Sea, and its presence at Starcar demonstrates that the communities of this period were capable of and willing to invest labor in the construction of built features that modified their immediate environment. The seasonal occupation patterns suggested by the animal bone assemblages at Starcar and at other Mesolithic sites in the region are consistent with a model of annual movement through a landscape that included both the upland areas now visible in Britain and the lowland areas of what was then Doggerland. The communities that camped at Starcar in the autumn and winter may have spent their summers on the wetland margins and river valleys of the land that is now beneath the North Sea. The technology that the Mesolithic communities of Doggerland used to interact with their environment is preserved in the worked flint that has been recovered from both the British and continental margins of the drowned landscape. Microlith technology, the production of small, precisely shaped flint blades that were combined with organic materials to make composite tools, was the dominant technological tradition of the Northwest European Mesolithic. The microliths themselves were produced through a standardized sequence of operations that began with the preparation of a flint core, from which small blades were struck, and continued through the shaping of the blades into the specific geometric forms, triangles, crescents, rods, that were used as the cutting or piercing elements of composite tools. The hafting of microliths into arrows, spears, and knives required knowledge of adhesives, the use of birch pitch or similar materials, and a skill in combining different materials that represents a sophisticated understanding of the properties of the available resources. The distribution of specific flint types across the region provides evidence for the movement of people and materials across the Doggerland landscape. Flint is not uniformly available across the region, and the presence of specific flint varieties at sites distant from their geological sources indicates that either the materials were transported by the people who used them, or that they were exchanged between communities through social networks that connected groups living in different parts of the landscape. The scale of some of these movements, with specific flint types appearing at sites hundreds of kilometers from their sources, speaks to social networks of considerable geographic extent. The bone and antler tools recovered from Mesolithic sites around the North Sea margins include harpoon points, fish gorges, needles, and other implements specifically designed for the exploitation of aquatic resources. The importance of fishing and of the hunting of marine and freshwater animals in the Mesolithic subsistence economy is reflected in the elaborateness and the diversity of these aquatic tool forms, and the specific adaptations that some of these tools show to the exploitation of specific species, the large barbed harpoons appropriate for large fish or marine mammals, speak to a community with detailed knowledge of the aquatic environments they exploited. The boats that would have been necessary for the exploitation of the coastal and riverine resources of Doggerland have not been preserved in the archaeological record, but their existence can be inferred from the evidence for the movement of people and materials across water barriers and from the ethnographic parallels with other hunter-gatherer communities who lived in similar environments. Dugout canoes and skin boats of the type used by comparable communities in other parts of the world are the most likely technologies, and the rivers and wetlands of Doggerland would have been navigated by communities whose skill in watercraft was at least as developed as their skill in land-based hunting. The animals that shared the Doggerland landscape with its human inhabitants were the megafauna of the post-glacial period, a community of large mammals that represented the remnants of the Pleistocene fauna that had dominated northern Europe during the Ice Age. Woolly mammoths were still present in parts of northwest Europe in the early post-glacial period, though their numbers were declining as the climate warmed and the open steppe grasslands that they depended on were replaced by forest. The bones of mammoths recovered from the Doggerbank and from other parts of the southern North Sea floor demonstrate that these animals were present in the region during the period when the land was above water, and the worked bone and ivory objects occasionally recovered from the same deposits suggest that the communities of Doggerland were exploiting mammoth remains for raw materials even in the later phases of the mammoth's regional existence. Aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, were abundant across the Doggerland landscape, and their bones are among the most commonly recovered large mammal remains from the dredged deposits of the southern North Sea. The aurochs was a formidable animal, considerably larger than any modern cattle breed, and its hunting required skill, coordination, and specialized equipment. The communities of Doggerland were clearly capable of hunting aurochs, as the evidence from sites around the North Sea margins confirms, and the cultural significance of the aurochs hunt may have been comparable to that documented at Catalhoyuk in Anatolia, where the wild cattle occupied a central position in the symbolic as well as the subsistence life of the community. Red deer were probably the most important single prey species for the Mesolithic communities of northwest Europe, and their bones dominate the faunal assemblages of most of the well-excavated Mesolithic sites in the region. The deer moved seasonally between the upland and lowland areas of the landscape, and the communities that hunted them presumably adjusted their own movements to follow the seasonal migrations of the herds. The antler of the red deer was as important as the meat, providing the raw material for a range of tools and weapons that required the combination of hardness and flexibility that antler uniquely provides. The beaver, the wild boar, the brown bear, the wolf, the lynx, and a range of smaller mammals and birds completed the faunal community of the Doggerland landscape. The diversity of the available prey and the productivity of the wetland environments in particular meant that the communities of Doggerland were not dependent on any single species or any single food source, and the flexibility this diversity provided was an important buffer against the kind of resource failure that could threaten a community dependent on a narrow range of food sources. The question of what the communities of Doggerland believed, how they understood their world and their place within it, is one that the available evidence addresses only indirectly. The ritual objects recovered from Mesolithic sites around the North Sea margins, the red deer skull frontlets of Starkar, the elaborately decorated bone and antler objects from sites in Scandinavia and the British Isles, speak to a symbolic life that was genuine and complex, even if the specific content of the beliefs it expressed is not recoverable. The investment of skill and time in the creation of objects whose primary function was symbolic rather than practical indicates a community that placed value on the non-practical dimensions of existence, that had developed traditions of symbolic expression that were transmitted across generations and that held meaning for the people who participated in them. The treatment of the dead provides some information about the cosmological framework within which Mesolithic communities understood the relationship between the living and the dead. Mesolithic burials, where they have been found, show considerable variation in the elaborateness of the funerary treatment, from simple inhumations with no associated objects to more elaborate burials with grave goods that speak to beliefs about the afterlife or about the continuing significance of the buried individual within the community. The patterns of burial treatment, and particularly the evidence for the curation of human skeletal remains, speak to a community for which the dead remained part of the social world in some sense after their physical death. The specific beliefs of the Doggerland communities are not recoverable in any detail, but the ethnographic parallels with other hunter-gatherer communities living in similar environments suggest a worldview in which the natural world was understood as inhabited by spiritual forces or beings, in which the relationships between humans and animals were governed by specific protocols of respect and reciprocity, and in which specific places in the landscape, particular river confluences, hills, or wetland margins, were understood as locations of special spiritual significance. Whether the people of Doggerland had oral traditions that described the flooding of their world, that preserved memory of the land that was disappearing beneath the sea, is a question that cannot be answered from the available evidence. But the possibility is real, and some researchers have suggested that certain traditions about sunken lands, found in the mythologies of the peoples of Northwest Europe, may preserve transformed memories of the Doggerland flooding, stories that were originally literal accounts of a real event, transmitted across generations in the changed form that oral tradition typically imposes on historical events over long periods of time. The relationship between the drowning of Doggerland and the later history of the human communities of Northwest Europe is one of the more productive areas of current research. The flooding of Doggerland compressed the human population of Northwest Europe onto the margins of the new coastlines, and this compression was one of the more significant demographic events in the prehistoric history of the region. A population that had been distributed across a large landscape was now occupying a much smaller area, and the social consequences of that compression, the increased contact between previously more separated groups, the intensification of resource exploitation on the now crowded coastal margins, and the need to develop new social arrangements for managing the increased density, would have shaped the character of the later Mesolithic communities of Northwest Europe in ways that are still visible in the archaeological record, increasing the density of human occupation in the areas that remained above water. This compression may have had significant consequences for the social dynamics of the region, increasing the frequency of contact between communities that had previously been more dispersed across the larger landscape, and creating the conditions for greater cultural exchange, greater social complexity, and perhaps greater competition for the resources of the now smaller territory. The arrival of farming in Northwest Europe, which began around 6,000 years ago and which replaced the hunter-gatherer way of life across most of the region within a few thousand years, is one of the most significant transitions in the region's prehistoric history. The specific relationship between the flooding of Doggerland and the adoption of farming is a matter of ongoing research. Some researchers have proposed that the loss of the productive Doggerland landscape created population pressure that made the adoption of farming economically necessary, or at least more attractive, for the communities of the region. Others have proposed that the cultural disruption associated with the flooding, the loss of ancestral territories, and the social upheaval of displacement may have made the communities of Northwest Europe more receptive to the new ideas and new practices that farming communities were spreading from the southeast. The genetic evidence for the population history of Northwest Europe in the post-glacial period is beginning to address some of these questions. Ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Mesolithic and early Neolithic sites across the region is showing that the transition to farming involved a significant replacement of the existing hunter-gatherer population by incoming farming communities from the southeast, rather than simply the adoption of farming practices by the existing population. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Northwest Europe, including the communities descended from the Doggerland populations, did not disappear entirely, and their genetic contribution to later European populations is detectable. But they were substantially replaced by incoming farming communities in a process that constitutes one of the major demographic events in European prehistoric history. The implications of this finding for the story of Doggerland are complex. The communities that experienced the flooding of their landscape, that were displaced and compressed onto the margins of the new coastlines, were ultimately replaced by incoming populations from elsewhere, and the specific cultural traditions and the specific knowledge of the drowned landscape that they had accumulated were not transmitted in any traceable form to the populations that came after them. The modern recovery of Doggerland's history is a scientific enterprise that draws on an unusually diverse range of methods and disciplines. The offshore oil and gas industry, whose routine seismic surveys of the North Sea floor have produced the data that allows the ancient topography of Doggerland to be reconstructed, has been an inadvertent but essential partner in the scientific recovery of the drowned landscape. The seismic reflection data that petroleum geologists use to identify geological structures beneath the seabed also preserves detailed information about the ancient topography of the landscape, the buried river channels, lake basins, and coastal features that were submerged as the sea rose. The reanalysis of this industrial dataset for archaeological purposes, pioneered by researchers including Bernhard Hubner and the team at the University of Bradford, has produced maps of the ancient landscape that could not have been created from archaeological survey alone. The fishing industry's contribution, though less systematic, has been equally important in its own way. The material dredged from the Doggerbank and other shallow areas of the southern North Sea by fishing boats over the past century and a half represents a large and geographically distributed sample of the material culture of the ancient landscape, even if the lack of stratigraphic context limits its interpretive value. The study of the material in museum collections, much of it donated by fishermen who recognized the unusual character of what they were hauling up in their nets, has been the primary basis for the characterization of the human occupation of Doggerland before systematic scientific expeditions began. The scientific expeditions that have been conducted in the North Sea in recent years represent a new phase in the research, one that is beginning to produce the kind of contextual evidence that the dredged material cannot provide. Sediment coring, targeted at specific features identified in the seismic data, is allowing researchers to recover samples from ancient lake beds, river channels, and coastal areas, and to analyze these samples for the full range of biological and chemical evidence they contain. The results are producing the first detailed, site-specific accounts of the ancient environment of Doggerland, moving the research beyond the general picture provided by the seismic surveys toward the specific understanding of individual places in the ancient landscape. The integration of the various lines of evidence, the seismic topographic data, the dredged material culture, the sediment core environmental sequences, and the evidence from adjacent terrestrial Mesolithic sites, is the central methodological challenge of Doggerland research. Each line of evidence has its own temporal and spatial resolution, its own strengths and limitations, and the most productive interpretations are those that are explicit about what each type of evidence can and cannot show, and that are careful not to project the conclusions of one line of evidence onto the areas where another line of evidence is more directly applicable. Each line of evidence addresses different questions and has different limitations, and the most productive interpretations of the ancient landscape are those that draw on all the available evidence rather than relying on any single line of inquiry. The central mystery of Doggerland is not the fact of its flooding but what it contained. The specific character of the human communities that lived on the drowned landscape, their specific social forms, their specific ritual practices, their specific knowledge of the landscape and its resources, is lost in a way that is qualitatively different from the loss of the physical remains. Physical remains can in principle be recovered. Knowledge that existed only in the minds of the people who held it and in the oral traditions they maintained cannot be recovered from any physical evidence, no matter how complete. And what was lost when it went beneath the water? The territory that is now the southern North Sea was, at the time of its maximum habitation, one of the most productive environments for hunter-gatherer communities in northwest Europe. The combination of wetland, river valley, upland, and coastal resources in a single landscape of considerable size would have supported a population density that was high by the standards of the Mesolithic period. The specific size of that population is impossible to estimate with any precision from the available evidence, but the scale of the landscape and the quality of its resources suggest that it was not a marginal place. What the communities that lived on this landscape knew about it, the accumulated knowledge of specific resources, specific routes, specific places in the landscape that held particular significance for hunting or for ritual, is the most significant category of loss associated with the drowning of Doggerland. This knowledge was carried in the minds of the people who possessed it and transmitted through the oral and behavioral traditions of the communities. And when those communities were dispersed by the flooding of their territory, the knowledge they held of that specific place was lost with them. The physical remains of the communities, the camps and activity areas, the constructed features and the middens, the burials and the artifacts, lie on the seabed of the southern North Sea, buried under several meters of marine sediment deposited after the flooding. These physical remains represent the archaeological record of a major chapter in the human history of Northwest Europe, and they are in principle recoverable by the methods of underwater and marine archaeology, though the practical challenges of conducting systematic investigation across thousands of square kilometers of open seafloor are very substantial. The specific social and cultural characteristics of the Doggerland communities, the forms of their social organization, the specifics of their ritual practices, the character of their relationships with the communities of the surrounding regions, are questions that the available evidence cannot yet answer in any detail. The outline of what Doggerland was is becoming clearer as research progresses. The specific texture of the lives lived on it, the individual experience of people who knew this landscape as their home, remains largely beyond reach. The possible connections between the memory of Doggerland and the traditions of the peoples of Northwest Europe is one of the more speculative but genuinely interesting dimensions of the subject. The myths and legends of the peoples of the North Sea coasts contain numerous traditions about sunken lands, and the comparison between these traditions and the geological reality of Doggerland is one that researchers approach with appropriate caution. The methodological challenge is that the connection between a specific oral tradition and a specific historical event can almost never be demonstrated directly from the available evidence, and the similarity between a myth and a real event is not sufficient to establish that the myth is a memory of the event rather than an independent narrative that happens to resemble it. About territories that were once above water and that are now beneath the sea. The traditions of the Welsh about Cantor ar Gwylod, the Lowland Hundred, a kingdom said to have been drowned beneath the waters of Cardigan Bay, the Breton traditions about the sunken city of Ys, the Cornish traditions about a land called Lyonesse that is said to have connected Cornwall to the Scilly Isles before being submerged, are all examples of a recurring motif in the mythological traditions of the Atlantic coast of Europe. The question of whether any of these traditions preserve a genuine memory of the Mesolithic flooding events, transmitted across more than 100 generations of oral tradition, is one that cannot be resolved with certainty, but that deserves serious consideration. The transmission of specific historical memories across the very long periods of time implied by the Doggerland hypothesis, from the Mesolithic to the historical period in which these traditions were first recorded, would require a degree of cultural continuity and narrative stability that is unusual by the standards of what we know about oral tradition. Oral traditions in general are not reliable transmitters of specific historical information over very long periods, tending to transform specific events into archetypal stories whose connection to the original events becomes progressively more abstract with each retelling. A genuine memory of the Doggerland flooding, if it existed in the oral traditions of the Northwest European peoples, would almost certainly be unrecognizable as a literal account of the event. But the flooding of Doggerland was not a single event. It was a process that continued for thousands of years, that affected many different coastlines in many different ways, and that would have been visible as a real and ongoing transformation in the landscape within the memory of each generation that experienced it. Communities living on the coast of what is now Britain in the later Mesolithic period, watching the sea gradually advance up the estuaries and over the marshes of their coastal territory, would have had direct experience of land disappearing beneath the water, and the stories they told about this experience would not need to be transmitted across many generations to remain connected to a real event. The traditions about sunken lands may be memories not of the specific flooding of Doggerland, but of the specific local flooding events that affected the coastlines of northwest Europe across the long period of post-glacial sea level rise. The comparison between Doggerland and other submerged prehistoric landscapes around the world places the North Sea example within a broader pattern of human habitation on continental shelves that are now beneath the sea. The continental shelves of the world's oceans were largely above water during the period of low sea levels at the last glacial maximum, and the recognition that many of these shelves were inhabited by human communities is one of the more significant insights of recent prehistoric archaeology. The standard accounts of the prehistoric past are based on the evidence that happens to be accessible, and the bias in that evidence toward the land-based record has produced a systematic underestimate of the importance of low-lying coastal and continental shelf environments in the human past, and many of them were inhabited by human communities before the post-glacial sea level rise covered them. The continental shelf of the Persian Gulf, which was largely dry land at the time of low sea levels and which would have been an inhabited landscape before it was flooded, is one example. The continental shelves of Southeast Asia, connecting the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines to the mainland of Asia across what is now the South China Sea, are another. The continental shelf of the Atlantic coast of North America, extending far beyond the modern coastline across the shallow Georges Bank and other features, is a third. In each of these cases, the flooding of the continental shelf involved the loss of inhabited landscapes, the displacement of communities, and the submergence of the archaeological record of those communities under marine sediment. The total area of continental shelf that was above water at the last glacial maximum and is now beneath the sea is very large, and the human population that may have lived on these now submerged landscapes is a significant fraction of the total human population of the last glacial maximum period. The recovery of the archaeological evidence from these submerged landscapes is one of the major frontiers of prehistoric archaeology, and the methods being developed for the investigation of Doggerland are directly relevant to the investigation of submerged landscapes in other parts of the world. The seismic survey approach, the sediment coring strategy, the analysis of dredged material. All of these are methods that can be applied, with appropriate modifications, to the study of other submerged prehistoric landscapes, and the experience being accumulated in the North Sea is informing the research designs being developed for investigations elsewhere. The scale of what has been lost to sea level rise is a sobering dimension of the overall picture. The archaeological record of the last glacial maximum and the immediately post-glacial period that is accessible to land-based research is only a fraction of the total record, and the fraction that is preserved on the submerged continental shelves may contain evidence for aspects of human behavior, social organization, and cultural development that are not visible in the land-based record. Doggerland is one window into this submerged world, and what it reveals about the richness and the complexity of the human occupation of low-lying coastal environments suggests that the submerged record as a whole is a significant resource for the understanding of human prehistory. What makes Doggerland different from other drowned prehistoric landscapes is the combination of the quality of the evidence that is becoming available and the specific historical significance of the region. The North Sea is one of the most intensively mapped and most extensively studied bodies of water in the world, and the density of the data available for research purposes is itself a consequence of the industrial and economic importance of the region rather than of any specific archaeological interest. The serendipitous availability of this data for archaeological research is one of the more productive accidents of the relationship between industrial activity and scientific inquiry, and the researchers who recognized its potential for the study of the drowned landscape deserve credit for the creativity of their approach. As a consequence of its importance for the oil and gas industry, for shipping, and for the management of fisheries, the data that has been accumulated about the geology, the bathymetry, and the sedimentary history of the North Sea floor as a result of these industrial and scientific activities is available to researchers in a way that comparable data from other continental shelves is not, and the reanalysis of this data for archaeological purposes has produced results that are not yet achievable in most other submerged landscape contexts. The specific historical importance of Doggerland derives from the fact that it was the homeland of the communities from which the later populations of Britain and Northwest Europe were descended, at least in part. The people who lived on Doggerland were the ancestors, biological and cultural, of the Mesolithic communities that occupied the British Isles in the period before farming, and the specific experience of their landscape and its flooding was part of the historical background against which the later history of the region unfolded. Understanding Doggerland is therefore not simply an exercise in recovering a lost chapter of prehistoric archaeology. It is part of understanding the specific history of the region that eventually became one of the most densely inhabited and most historically significant parts of the world. The drowning of Doggerland was also one of the more significant environmental events in the recent geological history of Northwest Europe. The transformation of a large connected landmass into a sea affected not only the human communities of the region but the entire ecology of the area, changing the patterns of animal movement, the distribution of plant communities, and the hydrological systems that had developed across the ancient landscape. The creation of the North Sea as a significant body of water altered the climate of the surrounding regions, moderating temperatures on the newly created island of Britain and changing the patterns of rainfall and storm activity across the area. Comparable in its consequences for the human communities of the region to the other major environmental transitions of the post-glacial period. The transformation of the landscape, from a large connected landmass to a set of islands separated by a significant body of water, had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate displacement of the communities who lived on the submerged territory. It changed the patterns of movement and contact between the communities of Britain and the continent, isolated the British Isles in ways that would eventually contribute to their distinctive cultural and linguistic history, and created the specific geographic context within which the later history of Northwest Europe would unfold. The pressures and tensions associated with the gradual drowning of Doggerland would have been experienced by the communities of the region across many generations, and the evidence for how they responded to the changing landscape is preserved in both the archaeological and the genetic records. The compression of the population onto the margins of the retreating coastline was not only a demographic event but a cultural one. Communities that had maintained relatively distinct identities through their association with specific parts of the Doggerland landscape were brought into more frequent and more sustained contact with each other as the landscape shrank, and the cultural exchange that resulted from this increased contact may have accelerated the development of the shared cultural traditions that are visible in the material culture of the later Mesolithic communities of Northwest Europe, as the lower-lying parts of the Doggerland landscape were flooded, would have increased competition for the resources of the remaining territory and for the best locations within it. The communities that had previously been dispersed across a large landscape were now occupying a smaller area, and the social dynamics of this compression, the increased frequency of contact between groups, the greater pressure on specific resources, the need to negotiate access to territories that multiple groups had claims on, would have been a significant source of social tension. The evidence for violence in Mesolithic skeletal populations is not abundant, but it is present. Healed and unhealed injuries consistent with interpersonal violence appear in a small proportion of Mesolithic skeletal remains from Northwest Europe, and the pattern of these injuries is consistent with the occasional violence that characterizes the relations between groups under resource pressure rather than the systematic organized warfare that characterizes later, more densely populated societies. The Mesolithic communities of Northwest Europe were not generally a violent people, but they were not immune to the conflicts that arise when groups compete for limited resources. The evidence for long-distance social networks in the Mesolithic, visible in the distribution of exotic materials across the region, suggests that the communities of the period maintained relationships across wide geographic areas that served social as well as economic functions. These networks would have been important resources for communities facing the disruption of their home territories, providing connections to groups in other areas that could offer refuge, support, and access to alternative resources. The social investment in maintaining these long-distance relationships, expressed in the exchange of materials and perhaps in the movement of people between communities through marriage and other forms of social affiliation, was part of the adaptive repertoire that Mesolithic communities brought to the challenge of managing life in a changing environment. The final phases of the Doggerland occupation, as the remaining land areas contracted to the Dogger Hills and eventually to the low island that the hills represented before they too were submerged, would have concentrated the surviving Doggerland population in a very small area. The social and ecological consequences of this final concentration are not directly documented in the archaeological record, but the experience of other island communities facing resource depletion and social disruption suggests that the final period of Doggerland's habitation may have been one of considerable stress. The end of Doggerland as an inhabited landscape did not come as a single moment but as the conclusion of a long process, and the communities that experienced that conclusion were themselves changed by what they had been through. By the time the Dogger Hills were reduced to a small island and then submerged entirely, the communities that had once inhabited the larger Doggerland landscape had been living with the memory of loss for many generations. The specific places that had been important to the communities of an earlier period were already underwater, already inaccessible, already part of a past that was real in oral tradition but no longer accessible in physical experience. The children who grew up on the shores of the shrinking Dogger Hills knew a different landscape from their grandparents, and their grandchildren would know a different landscape again. The communities that had once inhabited the larger Doggerland landscape had long since dispersed. The descendants of the Doggerland communities were living on the coastlines of what are now Britain and the continent, their specific memories of the original landscape already several generations old, the specific places that had meaning for their grandparents' communities already beneath the water. The process of loss was gradual enough that each generation experienced only its own increment of change, not the full scale of what had been lost across all the generations that preceded it. The cultural response to the loss of Doggerland, if it can be called that, was absorption into the broader Mesolithic communities of the surrounding coastlines rather than any kind of collective mourning or commemoration. The people who were displaced from specific parts of the Doggerland landscape became part of the communities of the areas they moved to, bringing with them the specific knowledge and the specific social connections they had accumulated, but losing the physical connection to the specific places that had given their previous identity its specific character. The archaeological record of the later Mesolithic in Britain and on the continent shows a period of relatively intense activity on the coastlines of the now separated landmasses, which is consistent with a population that had been compressed onto these coastal margins by the flooding of the inland territories. The shell middens of the Atlantic coast of Europe, the accumulated remains of shellfish harvesting that are among the most visible archaeological features of the later Mesolithic period, may in part reflect the intensification of coastal resource exploitation by communities that had lost access to the inland resources of the drowned landscape. The arrival of farming communities from the southeast, beginning around 6,000 years ago, brought a further and ultimately more complete transformation to the communities of northwest Europe. The hunter-gatherer way of life that had sustained the people of Doggerland and their descendants was replaced over the course of a few thousand years by the farming economy that would eventually reshape the landscape of northwest Europe as fundamentally as the flooding of Doggerland had reshaped it 8,000 years before. What modern science has learned about Doggerland in the past 3 decades represents a genuine transformation in the understanding of Northwest European prehistory. The work of Bernhard Hubner and his colleagues at the University of Bradford in developing the seismic survey approach to the study of the North Sea floor represents a methodological innovation that has transformed the field. Before this approach was developed, the study of Doggerland was largely limited to the analysis of dredged material, producing a general picture of human presence in the region, but no ability to locate that presence in specific parts of the ancient landscape. The seismic survey approach provided the landscape context that the dredged material lacked, allowing researchers to ask not only whether people were present on Doggerland, but where they were and what specific features of the ancient landscape they were associated with. In using industrial seismic data to reconstruct the ancient topography of the North Sea floor, established the methodological foundation for the systematic study of the drowned landscape and produced the first detailed maps of the Doggerland terrain. This work demonstrated that the ancient landscape was not a featureless plain but a topographically complex environment with specific features, river valleys, lake basins, coastal marshes, that would have structured the movement and the settlement of human communities across it in specific ways. The project known as Europe's Lost Frontiers, a research initiative funded by the European Research Council and based at the University of Bradford, has conducted systematic scientific expeditions to the North Sea floor and analyzed the resulting samples for the full range of environmental and archaeological evidence they contain. The project has produced new radiocarbon dates for the timing of the flooding at specific locations, new pollen sequences documenting the vegetation history of the ancient landscape, and new evidence for human activity in the form of the wooden platform structure and other indicators of human presence in the submerged sediments. The analysis of ancient DNA from Mesolithic skeletal remains from sites around the North Sea margins has added a genetic dimension to the understanding of the Doggerland communities and their relationship to the later populations of Northwest Europe. The results of this analysis, showing a significant genetic contribution from the ancient Western hunter-gatherer populations to later European populations alongside the larger contribution from incoming farming communities, have given the Doggerland communities a specific place in the genetic history of modern Europe. The integration of these multiple lines of evidence, each developed using different methods and each addressing different aspects of the ancient landscape and its human occupation, is producing an understanding of Doggerland that is more specific and more detailed than anything achievable a generation ago. The picture is still incomplete, and major questions remain unanswered, but the outlines of what Doggerland was and what happened to it are now clear enough to make it one of the better understood examples of a submerged prehistoric landscape anywhere in the world. What remains uncertain about Doggerland is considerable, and some of the most important questions may never be fully answered by the methods currently available. The specific size of the population that inhabited Doggerland at its maximum extent is one of the most basic uncertainties, and it is likely to remain so given the limitations of the available evidence. The indirect methods that archaeologists use to estimate past populations from the density and distribution of known archaeological sites cannot be applied to Doggerland in any straightforward way, because the Doggerland archaeological record is not accessible to the kind of systematic surface survey that would allow site densities to be estimated. Population estimates for Doggerland are therefore largely speculative, based on comparisons with the population densities of similar environments documented by ethnographic research on hunter-gatherer communities. The available evidence, the dredged artifacts, the environmental sequences from sediment cores, the topographic reconstruction from seismic data, does not allow direct population estimates. The indirect methods that archaeologists use to estimate past populations from the density and distribution of archaeological sites cannot be applied to Doggerland in the same way they are applied to terrestrial landscapes, because the Doggerland archaeological record is not accessible to the kind of systematic survey that would allow site densities to be quantified. The social organization of the Doggerland communities is another area of genuine uncertainty. The evidence from terrestrial Mesolithic sites in the region suggests small, mobile communities organized around kinship and maintained through the social networks that connected distant groups. But whether the specific conditions of Doggerland, its particular resource environment, its specific topographic character, produced social forms that differed from those of the surrounding communities is not determinable from the available evidence. The specific fate of the Doggerland communities in the period immediately before and after the Storegga tsunami is one of the most emotionally compelling of the uncertainties. Whether people survived the tsunami in significant numbers, how they rebuilt their communities in the aftermath of the event, whether the tsunami accelerated the abandonment of the already shrinking landscape or simply removed a population that had already been substantially displaced. These are questions that the evidence can illuminate to some degree but cannot resolve with certainty. The question of cultural memory, of whether the experience of the Doggerland flooding was transmitted in any form across the many generations between the Mesolithic communities who experienced it and the historical populations whose traditions were eventually recorded, is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of the uncertainties. The possibility that the myths of sunken lands preserved in the traditions of Northwest European peoples contain transformed memories of a real geological event is one that researchers are taking increasingly seriously, while also acknowledging that the evidence required to confirm such a connection is not currently available. Doggerland changes how we think about the relationship between human communities and the physical world they inhabit. The standard accounts of human history tend to treat geography as a stable background against which human events unfold, as if the physical world were a fixed stage and human activity the only thing that changes. The story of Doggerland is a direct challenge to this assumption. The physical world changes, sometimes slowly and sometimes with startling speed, and the communities that live in it do not simply adapt to its changes as rational actors making optimal decisions. They are embedded in specific places, connected to specific landscapes through the accumulated experience of many generations, and when those landscapes change or disappear, something is lost that cannot simply be replaced by moving to a new location with similar resources, against which human events unfold, as a fixed stage on which the actors of history move and interact. The story of Doggerland is a reminder that the physical world is not stable, that the landscapes within which human communities build their lives and develop their identities can change in ways that are dramatic and ultimately irreversible. The communities of Doggerland did not choose to lose their homeland. They inherited a world that was already in the process of transformation, and they lived their lives in the knowledge that the landscape around them was changing, even if the full scale of that change extended far beyond any single human lifetime. The specific kind of loss represented by the drowning of Doggerland, the loss of a homeland that is not destroyed but simply rendered inaccessible, covered by water that preserves the physical evidence of what was there while making it practically unreachable, is a particular form of absence that has no close parallel in the more familiar categories of historical loss. The ruins of destroyed cities are visible. The memories of displaced peoples are expressed in their oral traditions and their cultural practices. But the remains of Doggerland lie under several meters of water and marine sediment, visible on the instruments of marine researchers but not accessible to the direct experience of the descendants of the communities that inhabited them. The relevance of the Doggerland story to contemporary experience is not simply metaphorical. The sea level rise that is currently underway as a consequence of anthropogenic climate change is expected to affect many low-lying coastal regions of the world over the coming centuries, displacing communities and submerging landscapes in ways that will create new Doggerlands in other parts of the world. The specific scale and pace of these future floodings will be different from the post-glacial flooding of the North Sea basin, but the basic dynamic of human communities adapting to the loss of low-lying territory as the sea level rises is the same. Understanding how the Mesolithic communities of Northwest Europe managed the gradual flooding of their world, how they adjusted their practices, their movements, and their social organizations to the changing conditions, may offer some perspective on how contemporary communities might manage the analogous challenge of coastal displacement in the coming centuries. The timescales are very different, but the fundamental human experience of watching the sea advance over land that was once familiar is not. The people of Doggerland lived on a landscape that no longer exists in the form they knew it, and their lives on that landscape are now accessible only through the fragmentary and indirect evidence that the sea and the sediment have preserved. The worked flint objects in museum collections, dredged from the Dogger Bank by fishing boats over more than a century, are the most direct physical connection to the people who made and used them. The quality of the craftsmanship visible in these objects, the precision of the knapping, the regularity of the blade forms, speaks across 8,000 years of submergence to the skill of the people who produced them. They were not making these objects carelessly or experimentally. They were expressing a tradition of craft knowledge that had been refined across many generations, a tradition that their parents and grandparents had also practiced and that they would have transmitted to their own children. The animal bones from the same dredged deposits connect the people of Doggerland to the specific animals of their landscape, and the occasional marks of cutting and scraping on these bones speak to the specific activities of food processing that left their traces on the material. The mammoths whose ivory was sometimes worked into tools, the aurochs whose bones were split for marrow, the deer whose antlers were shaped into weapons. These were the specific animals of a specific landscape, and the relationship between the human communities and these animals was one of the central features of daily life on Doggerland. The wooden platform built at the lake edge, the feature identified in the sediment core from the North Sea floor, is perhaps the most evocative single piece of evidence for the human presence in the drowned landscape. A group of people at some point between 10 and 8,000 years ago drove posts into the soft sediment at the edge of a lake in what is now the southern North Sea and built a platform that extended over the water. We do not know what the platform was for. We do not know whether it was used for fishing, for the processing of aquatic resources, for ritual activities, or for some other purpose entirely. But the decision to build it, the act of shaping wooden posts and driving them into the ground and constructing a surface that extended over the water, was the decision of specific people who had a specific purpose and a specific understanding of the environment they were modifying. Those people are gone, and their landscape is gone, and what they knew about both is gone with them. What remains is the physical trace, the worked stone, the animal bone, the wooden post, the peat on the seabed. These remnants are enough to confirm that the landscape was real, that the people were real, and that what they built and what they knew is worth the effort of recovery. The effort of recovery is slow and expensive and technically demanding. The sea does not give up its evidence easily, and the methods required to work with that evidence require the collaboration of archaeologists, marine geologists, environmental scientists, and engineers in ways that few research projects can sustain. But the picture that is emerging from that effort is one that reshapes the understanding of the prehistoric past in ways that justify the cost, and the communities whose traces are being recovered from the seabed deserve the recognition that the effort of recovery is finally beginning to provide. The image that Doggerland calls up, the image that the evidence returns to repeatedly, is the image of land beneath water. The floor of the southern North Sea is the land that was. The sand and gravel of the Dogger Bank are the surface of the hills where communities camped and hunted. The peat deposits that fishing boats pull up in their nets are the marsh vegetation of the wetland margins, compressed and preserved by the weight of the water above them. The river channels visible in the seismic surveys are the valleys where the communities of Doggerland moved between their seasonal camps, following the animals and the resources through a landscape that they knew and that knew them, in the way that a community knows the landscape it has inhabited across many generations. The sea that covers this landscape is the same sea that washed over it 8,000 years ago, and the continuity between the ancient flooding and the present water is one of the more immediate connections between the Doggerland story and the current world. The water that drowned Doggerland did not drain away. It is still there, still covering the same landscape, still carrying on its surface the ships that cross from Britain to the continent along routes that the people of Doggerland could have walked. The sea that created the English Channel is the same body of water that people cross every day on ferries and in tunnels, connecting the countries that were once part of the same landscape. Advancing up the river valleys, flooding the wetland margins, isolating the Dogger Hills into an island that grew smaller each century until it too was covered. The water that drowned Doggerland is the same water that washes against the eastern coast of England today, that separates Britain from the continent, that provides the specific geographic context for the later history of the British Isles. The sea that created the English Channel and the North Sea was the same sea that ended the world of Doggerland. The specific places that meant something to the communities of Doggerland, the specific river bends and lake margins and hilltops that had names and histories and associations, are now places in the sea. They have no names in any living language. They are known, where they are known at all, by the coordinates that researchers use to identify specific locations in the seismic data, or by the features of the underwater topography that allow them to be identified as specific ancient landscape features. The specific human meaning of these places, the stories and the memories and the associations that made them significant to the people who lived near them, is among the most complete of the losses associated with the submergence of Doggerland. What remains is the outline of the landscape, reconstructed from the physical evidence with increasing precision as the research methods improve. And within that outline, the faint traces of the people who lived there. A handful of worked flint objects in museum drawers, a layer of peat on the seabed, the stain of a wooden post in a sediment core. Enough to confirm that the world was real. Not enough to recover the specific weight of having lived within it. The research into Doggerland is ongoing, and the picture of the drowned landscape and its human inhabitants will continue to develop as new methods are applied and new evidence is recovered. The Europe's Lost Frontiers project has demonstrated that systematic scientific investigation of the North Sea floor can recover genuine archaeological evidence, and the wooden platform feature identified in the sediment core is likely to be only the first of several such direct traces of human activity that systematic investigation will eventually recover. The methods for underwater and marine archaeology are developing rapidly, driven by advances in remotely operated vehicle technology, in underwater sediment sampling, and in the analysis of environmental DNA preserved in marine sediments, and these advances will make possible investigations that are not currently practical. The analysis of ancient DNA from Mesolithic skeletal remains around the North Sea margins will continue to add to the understanding of the genetic history of the Doggerland communities and their relationship to the later populations of Northwest Europe. The specific genetic contribution of the ancient Western hunter-gatherer populations to modern European populations is an area of active research, and the results of future studies will refine the current understanding of how the Doggerland communities fit into the broader demographic history of Europe. The paleoenvironmental work, using pollen sequences, plant macrofossil analysis, and isotopic methods to reconstruct the specific character of the ancient landscape at specific locations, will produce an increasingly detailed picture of what Doggerland looked like at different times and in different places. This environmental picture will provide the context within which the evidence for human activity can be interpreted, allowing researchers to move from the general statement that Doggerland was inhabited to the more specific account of where people were living, what resources they were exploiting, and how they were organized in specific parts of the landscape at specific times. The full archaeological story of Doggerland will take many more decades of research to develop, and some of its most important chapters may never be fully recovered from the evidence that has survived. But the direction of the research is clear, and the commitment of the scientific community to the investigation of this submerged chapter of human history is real and growing. The land beneath the North Sea is beginning, slowly and carefully, to give up its secrets. The pace of that process will accelerate as the methods improve and as the data accumulated from previous research makes new investigations more targeted and more productive. Each sediment core provides context for the interpretation of the next one. Each dated feature provides a chronological anchor for the environmental sequences that surround it. Each discovery of direct evidence for human activity provides a template for the search for further evidence in similar depositional contexts. The research into Doggerland is at an early stage of a process that will continue for many decades, and the understanding that exists today will look incomplete from the perspective of the research that will be conducted in the years and decades to come. The North Sea is quieter at dawn than at any other time. The wind that crosses it from the west or the east has not yet reached the force that will make the surface choppy later in the day, and the light is still horizontal, moving across the water in long planes that reveal its surface texture without the harsh overhead brightness of midday. The color of the shallow southern sea in this light is a particular shade of green-gray that is unlike any other water, specific to this specific depth and this specific combination of dissolved materials and suspended sediment. The shipping lanes that cross it are still active, the distant lights of container ships and tankers moving on the horizon, but the immediate surface of the water is calm in the early morning in a way that it rarely is later in the day. The color of the water changes as the light strengthens, from the dark gray of early morning to the green gray of the shallow southern sea, and the surface catches the first light in flat, shifting planes that give no indication of what lies beneath. Beneath the water, at depths of between 20 and 100 meters depending on the specific location, is the floor that was once the surface of Doggerland. The buried river channels are there, cutting through the soft sediment in patterns that follow the gradients of the ancient landscape. The peat deposits are there, the compressed remains of the marshes that lined the river margins. The bones of mammoths and aurochs are there, scattered through the sediment layers that accumulated across the period of the landscape's above-water existence. And somewhere in the sediment, in specific locations that researchers are still working to identify, are the traces of the people who lived on this land. The worked flint, the wooden post, the occasional bone that carries the mark of a stone tool. The land beneath the North Sea is not a ruin in the sense that Petra or Catalhoyuk are ruins. It is not a place that can be visited or walked through. It is a place that can only be approached through instruments and through the patient analysis of the evidence that instruments recover. But it is a real place, with a real geography and a real human history, and the effort to understand it is the effort to recover a chapter of that history that would otherwise be entirely lost. 8,000 years ago, the people who lived on this landscape woke in the morning to a world that was, in most respects, indistinguishable from the worlds of their parents and grandparents. The sea was there, at a distance, beyond the wetland margins. The rivers were flowing. The animals were moving through the forest. The specific knowledge of how to live in this specific place, accumulated across generations, was intact and sufficient. They could not have known that their world was ending, not that day, not in any way they could have named. They lived their lives, and the sea kept rising, and in the long slow time of geological change, their land became the floor of the ocean. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.